Glad to be back, even though it's a little bit colder than I would like as a Floridian, but I'm happy to see all your beautiful faces today. We'll talk today about cultural and religious institution building, and it's a timely topic because it's going to intersect the next two lectures. So I'm kind of setting you guys up for Dr. Sharfstein's brilliance next week. But as I thought about this topic, I realized that they were connected in a really profound way. That is to say that Black Nashvillians' religious institutions function as they function as a crucible and a repository of African American culture. So what I'm suggesting is that they served as a repository for a lot of the things that they brought from Africa. But by the same token, their exposure to what eventually would become America helped it to create something new. A couple of quick points I want to make. This church is not in Nashville. This is actually in a place called Promised Land, Tennessee. And Promised Land was established shortly after the war by a group of U.S. colored troops who had been discharged. And they set up this town, and it was an all-black town, and they still celebrate their heritage today. And in that little church there, if you were able to go there on Sunday, you could see a little bit of African culture. You could hear a lot of what had been developed here in America as enslaved and freed persons. And the minister of that church for most of its history was a prominent leader in the community. And right next door to it is a church. Is a school. A school that at least two generations of Promised Land residents got their primary education. So Promised Land, in one sense, represents just about everything I want to discuss today in terms of religious and cultural institutions. And by the way, a woman who grew up in the church makes the best sweet potato pies in Middle Tennessee. I'm sorry about that. Another thing I want you to consider, when we think of the people, of the Africans who were brought here, right, up until roughly the 1820s, I humbly submit to you that people of African descent outnumbered any other people that came across the Atlantic. Most of them were not Christians. The western part of Africa that they came from, they practiced Islam. And this gentleman on the screen here, his name is Mansa Musa. He was one of the kings of Mali, and he was also rumored, some scholars have said that he was the wealthiest guy to ever live. His net worth was estimated a couple of years ago around $400 billion. But most of them are practicing Islam. And one of the things that I oftentimes wonder is if you have that large number of people coming over, what happened to them? Well, some of them may have embraced Christianity, but some of them may have been hidden in plain sight. And this is one of the things that I'm working on here in Tennessee, to see if I can find someone of African descent here and try to discern whether or not they were actually Christians or not. Quick story, and then I'll get to the real thing I want to talk about today. At my last job, I worked in Savannah, Georgia, and I was able to meet a Gullah gentleman who grew up on Sapelo Island, and he used to talk about his grandma, right? And he said that his grandma told stories of her grandfather. Okay, and her last name was Bailey. Her name was Cornelia Bailey, Bailey. And she said that her grandfather prayed 5 times a day, faced east when he prayed, didn't eat any pork, and he fasted for a whole month every single year. And when you think about that, you're like, wow, if I wouldn't have told y'all anything about him, you probably would say, okay, this guy's practicing Islam. And his name was Bailey, but he wrote it like this. He spelled it Bilali. And when you see that, immediately you recognize that you're like, okay, that's not an anglicized name. But when we go to the census, you see a whole bunch of Baileys living on Sapelo Island. And there's still a bunch of them there today, right? So what I'm saying to you as we explore religious institutions today, I'm talking about the stuff that we know, but there's a lot of stuff that might be flying up underneath the radar that deserves some attention as well. Well, most of the Africans that arrive here, they are practicing Christianity because this is what Robertson and Donaldson were. This is what their masters practice. And you don't really have a big conversion until the Great Awakening occurs. And this is a movement that began roughly around the 1720s and 30s and 40s. And this sort of religion appealed to African Americans, to these enslaved populations, because it kind of mirrored what they experienced in Africa, in that these sermons were very, very emotional. You had people crying, you had people exhibiting all sorts of manifestations of the spirit, if you will. But this begins to resonate with them. And when you start thinking about this, you know, when they start crying, they start speaking in tongues, they start doing all of these things, they're speaking directly to God. So now, you know, on one hand, the authority that their master had is compromised a little bit, right? Because now they have a direct line to God. But there are other things that resonated with them. That is, they heard sermons about Jesus blessing the poor, the weak, the infirm, and the humble. He said that the last would be first and the first would be last. This is appealing to them. But then when they heard their slave masters preach from the Old Testament and they speak from the book of Exodus, and they listened to what was said during that first conversation that God has with Moses when he tells them, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt. So this conversation leads them to believe that God knows their plight, but more importantly, that he was going to send somebody to deliver them. So that's where we are when Robertson and Donaldson arrive in this area that would become Nashville. They worshiped with their enslaved population, and as the 1730s progress, African Americans find them in the midst of a type of Christianity that provided hope. But it was paradoxical on a certain level as well because, they're hearing their masters preach sermons that God saw human beings as equal. But the slave masters, the one that are teaching them this, they don't see everyone as equal. So as they are worshiping with their masters, some around the various churches here in Nashville began to call for the creation of churches, or not even churches, I guess, spaces where they could worship God as they saw fit. And when you start thinking about what type of services they would have, they would need something that would provide hope for the future. They would need space a space that could be cathartic in a way, because you imagine them experiencing what they experienced during slavery all week, and then they might have a schedule that allows them to work until Saturday noon, and they have Saturday afternoon, and then Sunday to focus on God. And this space becomes a space that is cathartic. That is, they could release all of the things that had troubled them. But they couldn't do this while sitting amongst their masters, right? Masters wanted them to be kind, to be quiet, to behave in an orderly fashion. But later on, when we see them develop their own churches, we see very emotional responses in these churches. So they began to call for the creation of churches where they could worship God as they saw fit. These early quasi-independent churches took different forms. One of the earliest was the Colored Christian Church, and they called themselves the Disciples of Christ. This was over on Vine Street. Then you have the informal Grapevine Church, which was located on this plantation, on the Belle Meade plantation. And then you have the McKendree Methodist Episcopal Church, a church that's requiring its black members to worship in the balcony. In 1838, McKendree had 366 white members, as opposed to 466 black members. So blacks are representing the majority in this church, right? Then finally, in 1851, they received permission to create their own church. They rent a small space on what was then Cherry Street, and ultimately they build a church in 1853 on what becomes known as Hines Street. The name of this church today, and you guys probably all know this church, the name of this church today is Capers. Well, back then it was called Capers Memorial Episcopal Church. That's the Capers off of, what is it? You know where Charlotte and the Burger King is? You make a right by the Burger King. Okay. All of my directions seem to have something to do with food these days. But this is how it looks today. This was a church that was built by the black architectural firm McKissick and McKissick. And you can go visit that church today or Sunday, if you like. It's a very warm and giving congregation there. But this church was built, and it's the first brick church in this city that's built for African Americans, and that is significant. Then in 1847, African Americans who had been affiliated with the city's First Baptist Church, they received permission to rent the city's old school building. So they're renting this building, they're meeting 3 Sundays a month, but still they had to worship under white supervision. And bear in mind, this is 1847, right? Nat Turner's rebellion had occurred in 1831. And Nat Turner was a preacher. So you can imagine the type of paranoia that's going on in the South. Okay, we want our enslaved population to go to church, but we kind of want to know what they're talking about on Sunday mornings. So 3 Sundays a month, they had to worship with white supervision. This church functioned primarily as a mission of the First Baptist Church. And that is, they are worshiping, but there's certain sermons that, if you're a slave master, you don't really want your slave population to hear. But you do want them to go to church. So, and I found this quote, and it was really interesting because it represents this sort of great paradox, if you will, between being a slave master and a Christian, and if you could even reconcile the two. Now, true enough, they did find some scripture that seemed to facilitate this sort of relationship. But by that same token, there's certain parts of the Bible that suggests that this might not be the correct way to live. But this was a statement that was issued to this population that are worshiping on their own in this mission. It says, all servants are bound by the law of God to serve their owners faithfully, as well as the violent and wrathful, as the good and gentle. So, and that's one we have to let sit for a little bit to see if it even makes any sense, right? But this is basically what they are operating under, this sort of guideline. But nevertheless, you have ministers that emerge that become very capable and well known in this city. One of the most important is Nelson Mary. Nelson Mary was born a slave in Kentucky in 1824, And he arrives in Nashville around 1845. He becomes the first ordained black minister in Nashville. And this guy, you know how if you select a religious leader, you want him to be kind of active? Well, he was very active. We know that he established, or he organized rather, at least 14 churches here in Nashville. He was also the founder of the Tennessee Colored Baptist Association. He found time to edit the Colored Sunday School Standard. So he's very, very active in the community. But nevertheless, and I'm reminded of a joke. An Episcopal priest told me this joke, and he realized that I was a Baptist, and I think he might have been trying to be kind of funny. But he was driving me around Savannah, Georgia, and said, yes, Dr. Williams, you know, y'all black Baptists, y'all multiply by dividing. And you know, I wanted to say nothing, but I ain't have anything for it, right? Because he's just kind of the truth. So, Nelson Mary's church, as a result of some disputes between the congregation, they split into 3 churches. And these churches are still around today. You have, at the top here, you have First Baptist Capitol Hill, and that's where I attend. This church here is Mount Olive. Mount Olive is right across the street from Tennessee State. And this is Spruce Street Baptist Church. So these churches figure prominently in just about every major movement that we see in this town, whether it's civil rights, and you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with the history of First Baptist Capitol Hill with Kelly Miller Smith. Spruce Street is significant, both in the civil rights movement. I'm going to show you in a little bit how it's significant in terms of politics, black politics in Nashville. And Mount Olive as well. So these churches that come up out of this period that was led by Nelson Mary become anchors for every major movement that we have of the 20th century. So when I look at these and I think about, because we really don't have any monuments around the city to enslavement or even to the period that covers the transition from slavery to freedom. We do every time we walk by one of these churches that have that were opened after 1865, that represents a direct bridge. One of the many, many things that African Americans desired, and this is true of Nashville and throughout the South, once freedom came, they wanted an education, right? We probably talked about that. They wanted to relocate and reconnect with families. But in most places in the South, they wanted the creation of an independent black church. And this manifests itself in Nashville just as it does in other places throughout the South. Religion becomes one of the central components of Nashville's culture. It's something that unifies and drives the African American community, and it manifests itself in several ways. In education, Fisk University, and this is one of the many, many photographs I have of Jubilee Hall. My dissertation advisor came to Jubilee Hall in 1966 to learn to teach African American history. It's kind of odd because here I am talking to you guys this morning, so I guess life does come full circle. But Jubilee Hall, the funds to raise this building was raised by the children of enslaved people. And what they did was they raised the voices, the songs that their ancestors sang in the tobacco fields and the cotton fields and the cornfields. Those songs that they lifted up, these students lifted up these same songs with their voices and were able to secure enough money to build this structure. And in my mind, this is one of the most arresting, the most beautiful pieces of architecture in Nashville. On my way to work every day, as soon as I get close enough, I start looking for Jubilee Hall, both as a sign of inspiration and it kind of helps me get my head together for the day that's going to follow. But even when we think about that name, Jubilee, it comes from, and my father would probably smack me side of the head because I can't remember the scripture right now. It's 25th chapter of Leviticus. Okay. Where they talk about the year of Jubilee. What it suggests is that freedom wasn't supposed to be a permanent position for anybody. Okay? Politically, it's interesting because I said Nelson Murray was everywhere, in that it was said that he had a beautiful voice. He fulfilled his duty as a pastor by reaching out to the homeless, to the hopeless, and to the condemned. First time I encountered him was because he was present at an execution here in Nashville. This guy, Bill Kelly, was being convicted for killing a white man. So I read this account, and I still haven't figured out exactly where it occurred, but as I began to focus on Mary, you find him attending executions in as far away as Pulaski, far away as Knoxville. So he's all over the place trying to fulfill his duty as a minister. So this brings us back to the point that I'm trying to hammer home here. And that is, these churches become very much concerned with not only their congregants, what their congregants are going to be doing in the hereafter, right? Because you want all these people that listen to you to go to heaven. By the same token, they become concerned with what's going on right here in the here and now. These sort of institutionalized churches function in both the spiritual and the secular, if you will. And now this gentleman, it's one of the, and you know how I'm always, when I'm talking about public history and I say we need to raise monuments to people, this gentleman is one, Preston Taylor. First time I heard his name, it was associated with a public housing development that was right outside of TSU. And things were pretty bad there from what I understand. But as I found, there's a larger story to that as well. But I had a student just ask me this the other day. He says, Dr. Williams, how come we always name public housing after famous black men? And I didn't have an answer for that. So, but Preston Taylor needs to be remembered. Preston Taylor was, gosh, where do I start? He was a minister, he was an undertaker, he was a businessman, he was involved in the creation of the Greenwood Park, Greenwood Cemetery. He was involved in the creation of Citizens Bank. So he did a little bit of everything. But Greenwood Park, I find it to be interesting in that the park sat right next to the cemetery. And I didn't realize how important that was until I spoke to a gentleman who actually had memory of his enslaved grandfather. And he said one of his grandfather's greatest wishes was to just get a cemetery created for their church. And I asked him, where were y'all burying your family before? And he said, we'd find, if we were working on a farm, maybe the guy that we worked for would allocate a certain space that we could bury our people in. But he said they got tired after a while of animals going through and rooting through the graves and so forth. So this cemetery was important because it represented a space where black Nashvillians could be buried with dignity and honor. And of course, Preston Taylor's undertaker company, his shop was second to none in the city. So from what I understand and from what I read, if he was giving you your last ride, your family was going to have a pretty good time on that day. Okay. But the Greenwood Park catered to African Americans' need for a space where they could celebrate, where they could be themselves. Greenwood Park was significant because they seemed like they always had some major event going on out there. When Jack Johnson fought Jim Jeffries, he broadcast it out at this site. And I can imagine how much fun that would be. But as we proceed, as we continue to look at him, Preston Taylor was involved in the push to get TSU established here in Nashville. And of course, Hadley Park. He, along with the gentleman on the left, his name is Benjamin Carr. He and Benjamin Carr are some of the major factors behind the creation of Hadley Park. And you can't really see it because Mr. Carr's head is over it, but Hadley Park, when it first opened, had a couple of swing sets, and that was it. But there, and it's interesting with that space because we're mindful that it was a plantation. So when you start thinking about public spaces and how we use them, they transformed it, they pushed for its transformation to a place where blacks labored without getting paid, to a place where they could come and relax. This park opens in 1912 as the first park in America to be created for the exclusive use of African Americans. It's the first. And the city of Nashville is looking at it as something that demonstrates the efficacy of Jim Crow. We got this park here, it's for African Americans, Jim Crow will work. It did not work. Henry Allen Boyd, the editor of the Nashville Globe, 3 years after this park opened, criticized it by saying the plants were dying, the trees were dying. He talked about tumbleweeds going through it. But still, when we look at this space, it becomes a place that draws in the African American community to North Nashville. Because when we start looking at real estate ads during this period, right, one of the things they say immediately is that, buy this lot over in North Nashville. It's near the streetcar line. It's near Fisk University. It's near the new state normal school. And it's near Hadley Park. So Hadley Park occupies an interesting space or interesting place in the history of the city. I teach a course similar to this one at Hadley Park every Tuesday at 9 o'clock, and it's one of the most interesting courses I've ever taught. Not because it's a bunch of seniors that can check me when I get to the 20th century stuff. I got to make sure my lectures are on point. But just them sharing the memories of the park and what it meant to them is a really special story. Okay. Now, women's clubs. Is this the group I spoke to? And I asked you guys to find out how many statues there were of black women in Nashville? Okay. How many did y'all come up with? I'm curious. Okay, and I kind of expected that because I've been looking for a couple of years now. I'm going to show y'all something. Talked about Preston Taylor. I talked a little bit about Henry Allen Boyd. But these guys married well. And I can remember my mom telling me I needed some help. So, these guys did really well, and we'll talk about them in a moment. But when we look at some of the things they accomplished, it's kind of tough to even conceptualize them thinking along these terms during this period. A few moments ago, I asked y'all to consider the connection between the church and other elements of society. And when you look at this, take a look at what you see. I'll read it to you. It says, Pearl High School debate, Spruce Street Baptist Church, Friday night, April 27th at 8 o'clock. It says, resolve that the formation of a separate political party would be in the best interests of the Negro. Don't miss this debate, the most interesting debate ever given in Nashville, regardless of time, place, subject, or contestants. Okay, those that are going to debate in the affirmative is Miss Tiny Clendening. Let me look at the laptop. Clendening. All right. Matches incomparable debater. Then Miss Mary Jackson, the eloquent platform speaker. The negative, Miss Ruth Upshaw, the civil tongue orator. And then Miss Mabel McGavick, the superb logician. It costs you 15 cents to get in there, 25 cents reserved. But when I looked at this really blew my mind. Why? Because it says Pearl High School, so that means that the oldest that these debaters are going to be about 17 or 18. And you think about this heavy subject that they are debating in the midst of Jim Crow, because this ad came out in 1917. So this is in the heart of Jim Crow, and African Americans are voting here. But oftentimes the people that run for office their interests don't really align. They have to go with the candidate they feel will do the less damage to them. Okay. And this particular slide is problematic, and it represents probably why we don't have a whole bunch of statues here in Nashville. I don't know if y'all can see this, but if you look carefully, you don't see any, you see very few of these women's first names. Mrs. G.L. Jackson, she was the wife of African Methodist Episcopal minister here in the city. let me see. Miss H.A. Boyd is Miss Henry Allen Boyd of Boyd Publishing fame. Let me see. Miss W.J. Hale. That's Miss William Jasper Hale. She was the wife of TSU's first president. Let me see if there's someone else. Okay. The point I'm trying to make is that these married women, and you got Miss Preston Taylor as well, and Miss John Henry Hale. Okay. All of these women we've identified were exceptional women in their own right, but if you're a student, you're trying to do research on them, how are you going to figure out who they were if you don't have access to the census? So we are working on that. My students are working on trying to put some names with these faces and to tell a little bit about them. And I'll share what we know about a few of them. Okay. There was a movement that began during the latter part of the 19th century called the Colored Women's Club movement. And this movement was led by mostly middle-class African-American women. But they, and we probably could have a conversation as to whether or not these were some of the earliest civil rights organizations in America. But these women were particularly concerned with the plight of very poor African-American women. And they operated from the idea that if they could lift up, if they could elevate the poorest black women in society, then the race as a whole would benefit. And they did good work, but to be fair, oftentimes they suffered from some of the same views of poor black people that whites had. But this was a major meeting that occurred here in Nashville. They are standing out in front of what was then First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill. It's located, y'all know where the Avon Williams Center is here off of Charlotte? Right next door. These women gather for a Colored Women's Federation meeting at the church. And as we look at them, all of these women look like they're dressed pretty nicely, right? So it's mostly middle-class women. But they represent various clubs from around the state. Some of these clubs include the Phyllis Wheatley Club. And although when we hear that, we think of, their literary clubs, but they are doing a little bit more than just sitting around talking about poems, right? You have members of the National Association of Colored Women, the NACW, and we still have a chapter of that at TSU today. The motto of the NACW was lifting as we climb, and it's really revealing because they're saying as they improve, they're going to bring people up with them. One of the more notable presidents of the NACW was a woman named Mary Church Terrell. She was actually out of Memphis, but she visited Nashville a lot. Okay. This is Mrs. William Jasper Hale, better known as Hattie Hale. She was born on Gay Street here in Nashville, and she had to be one of the most accomplished women of the late 19th, early 20th century in this city. She went to Fisk University and graduated at the age of 16. Then she went to St. Louis and she got a business degree. TSU opens up in 1912. She comes back to TSU and she gets the job as the president's secretary. Now, he gives her a position where she can work, where she can teach, but in essence, people are looking at her like she's the president's secretary. And I realized last time I spoke to you guys, I told y'all some terrible stories. I'm going to tell you something beautiful. right now. President Hale called an assembly in October of 1914. And it was in the evening, and he didn't tell anybody what was going on. So the students are there, and they notice that there are some guests there. They notice that the musician from Fisk University is there sitting at the piano. So they're waiting, and we're mindful that it's the evening. And William Jasper Hale steps out from behind the door, and he's suited up, he's looking good. Then Hattie Hale steps out, and she grabs his arm. And then the musician begins to play the wedding march. And I try to tell this on Valentine's Day and in my class, but I always joke with the fellas that the guys that come through TSU, they have some really strong game, just starting with our first president. But said all that to say that she was an exceptional woman. She wasn't the stereotypical president's wife, but she did do her due diligence in that regard, because she hosted Booker T. Washington in that house, and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. She hosted them in that house. But she was also intimately involved in the women's club movement in the city. And then you have Miss Hattie S. Jackson, and she was president of the Phyllis Wheatley clubs here in Nashville. Her husband was the prominent attorney here in Nashville, Reverend G.L. Jackson. His first name was Green. Now, I've seen what pastors' wives do, at least in the Baptist church, and I know they oftentimes are engaged, but they're not out oftentimes pushing stuff that they're not oftentimes involved in things where their husband's presence don't overshadow them, if you will. Well, she pushed for the creation of a Phyllis Wheatley wing at Meharry Medical College, at the hospital there. That came largely due to her efforts as a so-called ferocious or a very strong fundraiser. Okay. And then there's Miss Georgia Boyd, a woman who operated really in the shadow of her husband. Her husband was the editor of the Nashville Globe here in town. And he had a pen that in many instances shot lightning bolts. And she worked up underneath the publishing company and her husband's very, very powerful name to become the president of the Federation of Women's Clubs for the entire state of Tennessee. And according to the sources, she threw magnificent parties at this house around Christmas time. This house is located, I want to say, it's about 15th, around 15th Avenue North. You go down Jefferson, turn around 15th Avenue North, and you run into it. But although it doesn't look like much right now, that house had a reputation of being a place where people came to have a really good time. And lastly, this is Neddy Napier. And she was the husband of J.C. Napier. And we know J.C. Napier as being, well, where do I start? He was a government official, he was an attorney, he was a banker. He did a little bit of everything. But his wife was something else. His wife was the daughter of a black politician named John Mercer Langston. And he was he's the dean of Howard Law School when J.C. Napier and she first met. And they met each other, and apparently they fell in love, and I can imagine her father looking at J.C. Napier and seeing something in him because his daughter was really sharp. So they get married, and this was, and I said this kind of flippantly a couple of years ago, but now I said, okay, I said it and it should have meant it. This was the wedding of the century in America at the time. Because you have an up-and-coming guy out here in Nashville, a guy who's enslaved, whose master sent them off to get educated. And then you have a woman who is raised to be more or less a princess, if you will. So she gets married, and remember reading in the accounts of her wedding that she changed dresses 3 times over the course of the wedding. And she even had Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker, who was an African-American woman. That's the woman that made her dress. Okay. But she comes to Nashville, and this was a woman who always had concern with the poor. She's very much concerned with history as well. When it appeared as though the home of Frederick Douglass was about to be torn down, she led the crusade to earn money to prevent that from happening. So she knew how to get money. So when she arrived here in Nashville, she wanted to do something to assist working black women, and that is key, working black women. So she establishes something called the Day Home Club. And the Day Home Club provided everything that a working mother would need. So for you ladies out there that are mothers and you get out there in the workforce, what would be some of the things y'all would need? Child care. The Day Home Club offered child care for all 3 shifts, so around the clock. So let's say I want to work, but I don't really have the skills to do this job. You could come to the Day Home Club and get job training. She would take in kids after school. I guess what I'm saying, had after school programs for kids, and she'd actually have teachers there to teach them stuff. And healthcare was an issue as well, and she had a doctor on call. I want y'all to remember this name, because when y'all see it on the news, you can say, okay, well, this is what Dr. Williams was talking about. Josie Wells was a black woman who graduated from Meharry Medical College during the 1890s, and she sets up a doctor's office right at the corner of 4th and Charlotte here in town. And for a while, she was the only woman downtown with an office. And she specialized in diseases that affected women and children. So we're working on getting a historical marker or something put up for her. And when we do, I'm inviting all y'all to come, so you must come. But Neddy Napier's Day Home Club, it operated basically on donations, and she was a good organizer in that she set up lieutenants throughout the city, and she had these lieutenants target people with money. And you didn't really have to have money. If you had a grocery store, she had her lieutenant step to these grocery store owners and get food for the place. But they struggled. Initially, they opened on 4th Avenue North, and this is the last location of it. This is 4th Avenue South, right about the 600 block, right before you get to the interstate. But I showed the guys putting it in the ground because we did this first thing in the morning, and I wanted to be there when they put it in. And after I told the guys the story about Neddy Napier, basically what I told y'all, and it's like, well, Doc, we're gonna get this in the ground real quick for you. So that's that. Yeah. So I'll close by saying this. Much of what we celebrate in Nashville's history, whether it's the civil rights movement or the music industry or just our institutions, a lot of that can be traced to what we have discussed today. I said this the first time I spoke to you, and I'm saying it again. When African Americans came to this city, whether it was with Donaldson, or whether they came here in chains, whether they lived here as free people, whether they came here after the war, they did not come here empty-handed. Much of what they brought with them culturally contributes to everything we see here today. Thank you. Okay, questions? Yes.
I wanted to ask, it's related to Reverend Nelson Mary and also Mr. Napier, because you said that Nelson Mary came in 1847, that he had been enslaved, so I wondered if he was free. And also you said that Napier's master sent him to law school.
Not to law school, he sent him to get his primary education. Okay. Mary was born a slave in Kentucky, but he comes here and then he's freed. But he's working sort of as a steward of the church. As a matter of fact, they groomed him to be a pastor one day. And so that's how he ultimately becomes the first ordained black minister in the city.
Was he still enslaved?
When he first arrived here, but when he was a minister, he was free. Okay? Yes, sir.
The parks that were created, like Hadley Park and Greenwood Park, were they financed privately, or did they get any kind of city fund?
Hadley Park was a public park. That was something that Nashville pushed. Greenwood Park was something that Preston Taylor created. Okay. Let me get some from over here. Yes?
Emphasize more for the enslaved population than education? And why would religion be seen as something safer?
Education was frowned upon. And I could go into a long conversation as to why, but they did not want the enslaved population educated. Religion could be used as something, as a tool to enslave. For example, if you could get the enslaved population to believe that God had ordained or sanctioned their position as slaves, and that's a very powerful motivator to remain enslaved, right? And I'm talking mostly about the curse of Ham. You know, Noah's 3 sons and Ham being cursed by, Ham's descendants rather, being cursed by Noah, and biblical scholars arguing that his descendants migrated into sub-Saharan Africa. So that's really something profound, because if you believe that, then if I enslave you and I treat you any kind of way, you got a problem with it. It ain't me. They were cursed by the man upstairs. Oh, yes. But it's one of those things where it was used to enslave, but the enslaved population took it and did something else with it. Nurturing, cathartic in a way, because when they worshiped, and I said this and I didn't go into a whole lot of detail on this, other times African Americans would sneak away to worship God as they saw fit. So if there was a cabin in an out of the way place, they could go there, and oftentimes they would use pots and pray and shout into the pots. There's an old gospel song, and I forget the name of the group, that said, I couldn't hear nobody pray. Y'all know that? I was way down yonder all by myself, and I couldn't hear nobody pray. It's talking about sending somebody out while they are worshiping to see if they could be heard. And according to the story, the guy comes back and they said, where were you? He's like, I was way down yonder all by myself and I couldn't hear nobody pray. And we hear that and I used to hear that all the time as a child and it never resonated. Other things that you might be catching it on this side, but one day things were going to be better. And then, of course, the idea that God was going to send you a deliverer. So it could be used for good and bad. That's a long way of answering your question, I'm sorry. Okay, somebody else. Yes, ma'am. I can't pull it off the top of my head, but the printout is on my computer at my house. So if you give me your contact information, I'll send it to you. I can make it available to everybody if that's the case. Okay. And I'm sorry for not being prepared for that. Okay. Yes.
A couple of weeks ago, I think you mentioned that around 1851, there was legislation required that formerly enslaved African Americans leave the state. I want to know more about what those terms were. Did it only things applied retroactively, or only going to enslaved people free after 1851?
After 1851, what they were trying to do was cut off or arrest the process of masters actually freeing their slaves. Does that make sense? So a lot of them, well, those who wanted to free their enslaved populations, oftentimes they would do it in their wills. And it's kind of, and that stuff is accessible. If you got access to an ancestry account, you can pull up Tennessee's probate papers and read until your eyes get like mine. But what they were trying to do was to arrest that process. And that's why when we look and see the people who actually did, there were only a handful. As I stand before you today, I think of Joshua Hadley sent some slaves out. There's a planter it was an attorney in Franklin who did it. And Montgomery Bell, he sent 150 to Africa, but he could afford it because he still had 150 listed in his will when he died. So I guess to answer your question, it was a law that was passed to halt or to arrest the process of people freeing their slaves after they died, or just arbitrarily free, you know.
So was Nelson married free before or after 1851?
He was before.
So that's why he was allowed to stay.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. I think he was free by the time he got here. And yeah, I'm pretty sure he was free by the time he got here. I can get the dates for that though. Okay. Yes, sir.
It seems that after the Civil War, there was a big movement with that led by many primarily white congregations to resist the African American re-education, AMA, and they founded Fisk with the help of the Freedom Bureau. After the Civil War, in the latter half of the 19th century here in Nashville, was there any coordination between predominantly partnership, if you will, between predominantly white religious congregations and the African American community to resist African American institutions, churches, schools, and other social welfare programs, just like it was on a national level?
I think the biggest example of that would be Meharry Medical College in terms of collaborations between African Americans and white organizations. Although we celebrate the Freedmen's Bureau as being successful, and rightfully so, because those schools are still around, the smaller schools, like the primary and middle and high schools, those could be hit or miss. And I didn't talk to you guys about Reconstruction, but I remember reading Freedmen's Bureau agent writing to Washington, D.C., telling General Howard that they'd opened up 50 schools here in Middle Tennessee. And then in December, he writes that 50 schools burned to the ground. And I don't know whether those were the same 50 or what. But still, the fact that 50 schools burned to the ground, that is problematic. Right. But even with that, I forget the Hadley's name, but he was a carpenter. He actually lived out here now that I think about it. But he had moved to 17th Avenue North, right across the street from where Fisk was. He was a carpenter. He worked on Jubilee Hall. And the newspaper talks about him. He tells a story to the newspaper. He talks about working on the building during the day and serving as a sentry around the building at night. And he said that he feared that the Klan was going to attack him. And I hear that, but then there's conversations that the Klan marched up to Fort Negley and burned their robes, right, about 1870-ish. But we know Jubilee Hall isn't dedicated until 1873, so it's just, you have to try to reconcile that. But education was always a big thing. In my class, I sometimes argue that it became a religious denomination. You had Baptists, Methodists, and then people that wanted to go to school. Okay, well, maybe that came out wrong, I'm sorry. Okay, other question? Yes, ma'am. Excuse me. Okay, at Centennial Park. Okay. So we got the statue of Wilma Rudolph at TSU and the suffragists.
I don't know, Frankie Pierce?
Mm-hmm, Frankie Pierce.
You had mentioned her name.
I did not. Okay. All right, other questions? Okay, let me get her and I'll get you. Mm-hmm. Okay, how much detail do you want? Okay, one occurred during the 1890s and involved a guy out of Gallatin named F. Grizzard. He and his brother were accused of raping a girl up there. They killed his brother Henry right away, but they brought him to Nashville for protection. And the jail, we're mindful that the jail was located at the public square. Well, a mob of thousands came to the square and they abducted him from the jail. And they beat him and stabbed him and marched him to the Woodland Street Bridge. And they put a rope around his neck and threw him over the side and he died. There was a woman, formerly enslaved woman, who witnessed the whole thing, and she said she thought that there were so many people on the bridge that night that the bridge was going to collapse. But I think the most telling statement was what the sheriff said. The sheriff instructed everybody that was looking at the lynching. He said, He says basically, no one better mess with that body, because if you do, that's going to be you. That's one. Cordy Cheek lived in, I always struggle with saying this, so if y'all know the proper way to say this word, y'all help me out. Is it Murray County? Wow, I'm surprised myself. Cordy Cheek lived in Murray County, and he was accused of raping a girl. And they tried him and they acquitted him. But the folks down there weren't happy with it, so they brought him to Nashville and they put him in jail, and for his own protection. So finally, they decide to release him to his uncle. His uncle lives on Jackson Street here in Nashville. You know where the John Hope and Aurelia Franklin Library is on Fisk campus? If you go down Jackson Street, the main gate is right there. I believe their house, that his uncle's house, would have been right next door to it. And they came up here and got him and took him back to Murray County and lynched him. And I worked with some folks down there in Murray County, and the woman told me that the tree where they did all of that to him was recently chopped down or torn down or whatever. But she also told me something really compelling. She said she knew a man who was a child at the time, whose grandfather made him go and watch all of this as it transpired. John Hope Franklin was a student at Fisk when all of this went down. You imagine you're a college student, you go in there and it's right next door that something like this happens. And Franklin Roosevelt was visiting Fisk's campus, and so he felt as though it was a good time to confront him on his stand against lynching, because Roosevelt wasn't really saying anything about lynching. And the leaders at Fisk informed him that now wouldn't be the good time to raise this issue with them. And he says that he was told that the president was going to be in Atlanta at the same time he was going to be there, and then they would arrange a meeting. So lo and behold, he doesn't say anything. And he and Roosevelt are in Atlanta at the same time. He can't even get an audience. So when I hear this and I tell this story to my students, I'm like, okay, the right time to say something is when you feel it's the right time to say it, particularly when it comes to the issues of injustice. Okay, how many there? That's two. Another guy was lynched 1875. I forget his name. But he was abducted from the jail as well. And they shot him and stabbed him and threw him over the bridge, threw a rope around his neck. Somebody shot at him while he was hanging, the rope broke, and then he fell down into the river. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because there's some accounts that has this guy in Williamson County a couple of days later. And I don't know if I buy that or not, because and y'all can go to the Woodland Street Bridge, right? And that's a pretty nice drop. I don't see anybody getting shot and stabbed and hung and then surviving that fall and then is spotted in Williamson County a couple of days later. Okay. That's three that I know for sure. There's a fourth one that occurred near Cool Springs Galleria. I'm not sure, I can't remember his name. And I'm sorry, I've worn that question out there tonight. I am. Okay. Yeah, I was involved in placing those. Yeah. Okay. And that was the help. It was a young lady was the one that pushed for it. Okay. Anybody else? Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, I went to visit William Edmonds's grave in Greenwood
That's
Preston Taylor, is that where Preston Taylor's buried off?
that big monument that you see when you first come in, that's where he rests. And his house was also located, I don't know if it was his house or his office was located in the back. Yeah. All right, thank you all so much.